I'm Faith Rogers, host of today's program, Monkeypox, Keeping Up with a Moving Target. Thank you so much for joining us today. This activity is jointly provided by the Partners for Advancing Clinical Education, DKB Med, and the Institute for Johns Hopkins Nursing. This activity is accredited for ANCC and AMA-PRA Category 1 credits. Please visit our website for complete CE information. If you're tuning into our webcast, you can click that Claim Credit button on the webinar console. Otherwise, go to movingtarget.dkbmed.com, navigate to today's episode, and click the Claim Credit link. This activity is made possible today by in-kind support from DKB Med. All activity content and materials have been developed solely by the planning committee members as well as the faculty presenters. Today's learning objective is to describe the benefits of broader use of antivirals for monkeypox. Joining us today to discuss this outbreak, we have Dr. Paul Auwaerter, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He will be joined by Dr. Amesh Adalja. He is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. So, Dr. Adalja and Dr. Auwaerter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Faith, and delighted that Amesh Adalja is joining us. This is the second part of our conversation regarding monkeypox, which has been new to many of us in our practices and trying to help advise patients and navigate this public health emergency. Amesh, one topic that I think we didn't have with COVID out of the box was an antiviral. So tecovirimat's an antiviral that does have FDA approval under the animal rule, but does not have an emergency use authorization by the Food and Drug Administration yet for prescribing practices, but is available through the Centers for Disease Expanded Access Investigational New Drug Pathway. We had really limited information back in this late spring and summer regarding whether it's effective with this orthopox infection. Are we any wiser at this point about this? And, is this something that people should be really familiar with to help patients?
I definitely think this is the mainstay of treatment, especially for people who have intractable pain from proctitis, for example, or people who have lesions that might be encroaching on their eyes, or people that are immunocompromised or have central nervous system disease. This is the mainstay of treatment. And I think we are not completely confident in how well it works. And I think that stems from the fact that it hasn't really been studied that much in humans with monkeypox. We've got animal data that looks promising, and we clearly have a line of case reports and anecdotes that people do get better quickly, or they report a dramatic improvement in their pain or the healing of their lesions. So I think there's enough of a signal there. I don't know that we're going to get randomized controlled trial data that looks good. It's probably going to be a lot of observational, retrospective, and case control studies because I think it's going to be hard to randomize someone to the placebo group now that there's so much good news about this antiviral out there. So I think even though we're limited in the amount of human data we have, everything looks promising, and this should be something that clinicians turn to very quickly if they have a monkeypox patient. We have plenty of it. I know it's cumbersome to go through that paperwork process to get it, but it is something that does seem to have an impact, and it is something we're lucky to have, off the shelf and ready to go.
Yeah, I'll mention that we're lucky that we're now a site at Johns Hopkins with an institutional FDA 1572. So there's a little less work in order to get the drug, which we have on site through the courtesy of our state of Maryland Health Department. But for those people in practice, I'll mention that back in the late midsummer, when I had to treat someone in hospital, I think it took me over 3 hours to go through the paperwork and so on. But the Centers for Disease Control has shortened the form. They no longer have a required, but rather optional follow-up and so on. Is this the right strategy? I mean, I know the FDA did not grant emergency use authorization like some of the COVID drugs here, but we really don't have much data about this drug with monkeypox. So, and now with the optional follow-up, is it worth still pursuing it in this fashion through the CDC?
I think that's kind of a false alternative setup, that it's either no data at all or 3 hours of your time spent filling out forms. I think we've got to get away from that. We want to use this expeditiously. We want to optimize using it. But if you're a busy clinician and you have to fill out forms, you're going to prioritize who you give it to. You're not going to give it to everybody that actually qualifies. You're going to give it to the sickest patient. So you don't want the bureaucracy to get in the way of actually using the drug. But I think there are better ways to get data. So if you go back to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, we used IV peramivir, the antiviral, on emergency use authorization, and plenty of data was collected, but it wasn't cumbersome. You got that drug very, very quickly from CDC if you needed it in a flu patient. Or think about IV artemisinin, which we give to falciparum malaria patients. That's not even FDA approved for anything in the United States, but yet it's on the next plane from Atlanta to wherever you are in the country. And they collect that data, but they do it in a non-intrusive way. It doesn't seem to get in the way of actually prescribing the drug. So I think looking at how they did it with IV peramivir in the EUA and H1N1, or IV artemisinin for falciparum malaria, that's probably a better path than having you spend 3 hours filling out a form, which many doctors are not going to want to do or have the ability to do.
Yeah, I think you make really sound points here. And even during the COVID pandemic, we often had to turn overseas to the recovery trials, which granted were pragmatic, but really enrolled tremendous numbers of patients and got incredibly valuable information. And even if it's not placebo controlled, offers that kind of path, which unfortunately, since we don't have a real national health system or integrated public health response, means it's still a challenge, but there should be abilities to gather this data. And I love that you brought up those examples. So the antiviral, in my experience, has been generally well tolerated. It's oral. There's also intravenous formulation, which we haven't used yet, but have that as a capability. Is there anything that you've think people should know about? Should we empower patients a little bit to ask for it? I mean, who do you think should qualify and get it? I mention this because there is an AIDS clinical trial group which will be examining use of this drug, perhaps earlier infection, as generally infections treated with antivirals earlier do better than later when it's direct acting here. And often we're seeing people that have really a disease that's advanced quite a bit and therefore qualifying for some of the suggested treatments that the CDC advises in those groups.
I think that using TPOXX as broadly as possible makes sense, because I think we want to get data on not just outcomes that are related to severity of disease, but maybe some of the upstream issues, like, are you less contagious if you take this? Do you get back on your feet faster? Do you heal your lesions quicker? All of those answers are going to be obtained if we start using this more broadly, so that we can collect that data. Even if it's not randomized controlled trial data, it will actually help inform our use for monkeypox, as well as inform our use for smallpox if we have to use TPOXX in that situation. And I do think that patients should be asking their doctors when they're diagnosed with monkeypox, do I qualify for TPOXX? That should be something that they should be empowered to do, because I think sometimes doctors need a push, because if there is paperwork and bureaucracy and it's the end of the day, they may not want to do it. So I think it's important that patients actually advocate for themselves and talk about TPOXX, and hopefully we'll get more use of it and we'll learn a lot about how well it works.
Yeah, do we have a sense just from monkeypox disease generally yet, how many people may have mild to moderate disease versus more severe, which generally is how I think most people are using the drug, even though it's not difficult to obtain, but I think there are a lot of concerns about scarcity early on.
It's unclear to me, because I think if you look at severity and you say, does that mean they require hospitalization? Clearly, there's not very many people with monkeypox getting hospitalized. We've got 14,000 or so cases in the United States, and we've had 0 deaths. There's only been some reports of central nervous system infection. So it does seem that disease is shifted toward the milder spectrum. Although there may be a lot of morbidity when you think about pain or proctitis there, it doesn't seem to be that we're seeing a lot of patients with severe disease, but maybe we have to redefine severity when it comes to monkeypox. And it may be that it's the pain rather than CNS complications, for example, which were traditionally thought of as the severe end of that disease spectrum, that may be exceedingly rare. And it's the pain that we think about TPOXX having a role in playing.
It's interesting because I think back to the early days of acyclovir and how we used it in chickenpox, and we tried to gauge the severity of whether something was mild or not. This is, of course, all in the pre-immunization era and its use. And it just seems like this is resonating a little bit here, where we might be jumping in a little later than we should with a drug that might well have, good activity, although that's a question, as you point out, that we don't know yet.
I know that they've done some studies with, I think, in smallpox animal models, using it as post-exposure prophylaxis. So there probably is a role for using it up front, that it probably does have antiviral activity at that point with a benefit, a clinical benefit.
Yeah. Well, speaking of post-exposure prophylaxis, I know that is something that's a part of the recommendations, at least from the ACIP, for the vaccine known as Jynneos, the modified vaccinia vaccine that's non-replicating, so safe for immunosuppressed patients. Now, is this, as far as I know, no one in our state has really gotten in easily post-exposure, potentially, although that's one of the priorities for the limited supply we have. And many states are struggling with post-exposure prophylaxis versus, just immunizing people at risk. And the big advancement, of course, had been the early August EUA to say that this vaccine doesn't require sub-Q administration, but rather could be given by intradermal route, which might allow up to 4 to even 5 doses if they might be able to squeak out of a vaccine vial as opposed to just one. What should people know a little bit about these vaccine issues, Amesh, at this time, and the supply limitations? Just let's start there.
We know that the vaccine seems to be effective against this virus. It's something that makes sense as kind of the backstop to how we stop this outbreak. But the problem is that there just is not enough of it. And I think it's important to think of the history of Jynneos. It was considered an alternative smallpox vaccine for people who couldn't get the traditional vaccine that was in the strategic national stockpile in the event of a bioterrorism attack. So this was never really intended to be used as broadly as it is being used. And that's why there's so little of it. And I think that we've had problems using it in post-exposure prophylaxis because that relies on very good contact tracing. And the unique features of this outbreak are that many of these individuals have multiple sexual partners, some of them anonymous, that you can't contact trace. So post-exposure prophylaxis, which was used to eradicate smallpox from the planet, doesn't really apply in this situation because we don't have that good of contact tracing. So that's why jurisdictions went to just vaccinating the at-risk group. And of course, there's not enough of the vaccine to do it. And there's been logistical problems where we've seen websites going down and lots of technical glitches that have occurred, which are sort of reminiscent of the early days of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. But now it seems to be that they've hit their stride, and hopefully this dilution procedure of using the vaccine intradermally will stretch the supply to be able to get enough people at least their first doses of vaccine until we can catch up with supply. Of course, we don't have a lot of data there. There is some promising data there, but not a lot. And I think there was a little bit of a foul up there saying that everybody could get 5 doses out of these vials when there's a lot of wastage that occurs, and all of those dead volume syringe issues that occurred with COVID-19 are occurring now with this vaccine. But I think it remains the solution. I mean, I don't think people are reticent to use the older vaccine, which was used in 2003 with the outbreak that occurred in the Midwest with the prairie dogs. They're reticent to use it because the risk-benefit calculation is a little different with monkeypox and with the fact that Jynneos does exist.
Yeah, and I think you make sound points. We know that vaccinia-based vaccines replicating do have problems, especially if they get into the wrong host, like people with skin disease, atopy, or immunosuppression, compared to Jynneos. And you mentioned the data, which I think is the 2015 paper, which looked at intradermal administration by using this vaccine, generally in healthy volunteers. That looked like you had very similar neutralizing antibody generation compared to the traditional subcutaneous administration. One of the things that we've sort of seen, or at least news reports, is that the manufacturer has created a bit of a fuss about this move to intradermal. What's behind that? And is that something that will thwart continued use of intradermal? I mean, intradermal is a little more complicated. People have to be trained. It's not, people aren't just flipping a switch here, but is this something that the manufacturer may pose issues moving ahead if they see it being used in a non-traditional way?
I think it makes sense from the manufacturer's perspective if they're worried, because this is using a product in a way they didn't intend it to be used, but they're going to be blamed if it doesn't work. That they're kind of on the hook if it doesn't seem immunogenic or it's hard to administer intradermally and that vaccine goes to waste. That's them kind of being held responsible for something where they didn't really ask for it to be used intradermally. So I'm not surprised that they're kind of taking that cautious view, because they are kind of put in an odd position, because it's usually the manufacturer that's asking for something to be done or an emergency use authorization for their drug to be used in a different way. In this situation, it's the government issuing an emergency use authorization based on their own recommendation. So it's a little bit backwards, and I think that's probably what's the issue. Hopefully we get data pretty quickly that it is working and that our vaccinators are able to successfully intradermally inject, but it's all kind of I think very, very fast moving, and it's unclear where this will end up. But I think if we can use this vaccine intradermally and we have people that are qualified and able to vaccinate that way successfully, then I think it makes sense to probably switch to that and for Bavarian Nordic to go for formal approval in that situation, to use it in that way. But I think they're going to be cautious just because I think of all the risks that their product is now being exposed to that they don't control anymore.
Yeah, one last issue on vaccination here. The CDC has recommended the intradermal approach on a forearm, which is where we usually put PPDs, for example, and so on and so forth. But I think people have been concerned about potential for scar formation and whether this could be a stigma. People will look at it and see, for example, and whether it should be given more on the upper arm or perhaps elsewhere. What are your thoughts there? I mean, I haven't heard of a lot of scarification issues, but I suppose that's a potential. It is non-replicating, which to me makes it seem different and more like a PPD than with the traditional smallpox immunization.
And that's my understanding, that there hadn't been reports of scarring with this vaccine versus older smallpox vaccines or BCG, the tuberculosis vaccine. So I don't think that that's a real issue. I think it's something to think through, and it's something that you should be clear about with the public, saying this doesn't cause scarring so that people actually come and get vaccinated, because if people are refraining from getting vaccinated because they're worried about the scar and people realize that they were injected with the monkeypox vaccine, I think that's going to pose a barrier. So that should be something that they quickly answer, and they probably have that data right away to be able to say what those lesions look like, and they should publish those pictures as quickly as possible. And hopefully it is just like a PPD reaction that dissipates over time.
Right. Yeah, great. Thanks. Lastly, just in closing, every time there's a new problem, I always say there's opportunities to try to learn, do things better. And of course, here we have something, as you already mentioned, is unanticipated, but we're sort of MacGyvering use of our smallpox strategies here with the monkeypox. Looking at the broad perspective and what either public health or governmental agencies, a couple of quick thoughts on something that might be important for us to sort of acknowledge at this stage and maybe use to leverage future responses.
I think the biggest problem that we saw was testing in the early days. And this is not unfamiliar to people who followed the COVID-19 saga. And I think it really stems from the fact that in the early days of an emerging infectious disease outbreak, the tendency is for the government to use the CDC and CDC affiliated labs to do testing. And that clearly is not able to keep pace with the needs. So it's only when commercial labs like Quest and LabCorp and university labs get involved are we able to keep pace with testing. So I really think we have to think about, in the early days of an emerging infectious disease response, how do we poise the commercial labs to be able to go right away? How do we remove the barriers for them testing? And there were barriers like this with COVID, and there were barriers like this with monkeypox. And then only when they were able to test did we start to be able to do this. And I think this kind of scenario. And it's not just COVID and monkeypox. This also occurred with Zika, where there was very limited testing and you had to fill out all these forms to get tests done. That type of paradigm is not going to work when you need a very rapid response in an infectious disease emergency, and you need situational awareness. You need to be able to answer the basic question is who is sick and how many of them are there and how are they getting sick? And in order to do that, you have to have a proactive diagnostic plan. And I think that's something to take home. There's lots of mistakes to critique during the monkeypox outbreak, but that to me is the one that's the most actionable and the most glaring.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, there are always avenues like laboratory developed tests, but, it'd be nice to have a perspective or an ability to get something early rolled out, and labs can do that now with molecular assays relatively easily with minimal validation if you have spike samples or something that can be distributed to these labs to make sure that they can do their own in-house validation. Well, Amesh, I really want to thank you for sharing your perspectives. This is still, of course, an evolving story. We've learned with COVID that it's hard to predict what will happen, but hopefully we have a few more tools in the toolbox here than we did at the start of COVID, which is certainly encouraging. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and thank you so much again for those updates. For our learners, if you're tuning into our webcast, please click the Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, visit us at movingtarget.dkbmed.com. If you have any questions for our faculty, feel free to send those to qa@dkbmed.com. That's Q as in question, A as in answer, at dkbmed.com. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you for our next episode that will be launching in September. Take care.